we can clearly see the wreck, and we can see the wheelhouse up here.
There's this Nazi secret. No one can be sure about what's down there.
They were scanning routine waters, expecting nothing but sand and shadows. Instead, a silhouette appeared on the screen. The crew froze mid-step, lights danced over the hull, and an uneasy hush fell across the boat. Nothing about it made sense. Decades of records said this should not exist.
The atmosphere was very tense, very pressured. I had to locate not just one ship, but 2 ships.
What was this ship? Who sent it off course? And why had it stayed hidden all these years? What the salvage divers uncovered in this sunken World War II Nazi warship is a secret history never meant to be seen. The wreck that shouldn't have been found. Nobody on that boat was looking for a headline. The team was just scanning a quiet stretch of ocean off Norway, expecting nothing more than empty water and old seabeds. According to every World War II log ever recorded, nothing important went down there. The area was labeled as nothing more than a spot where ships once battled rough weather. So when the sonar operator suddenly froze and leaned closer to the screen, nobody expected what came next. The signal wasn't a simple wreck. It wasn't a fishing trawler or a lost cargo boat. The shape showing up on the monitor looked massive. The kind of mass you only see when something built for war is sitting on the seafloor. Everyone crowded around the display as the outline sharpened. A long, narrow frame, high steel arches, the full, unmistakable silhouette of a Kriegsmarine destroyer, a Nazi warship, in a place where history claimed nothing like that had ever gone down. Right away, the divers knew something was off. Warships that sink to that depth normally collapse under pressure. Steel bends, breaks, and folds like paper. But this one, it looked almost untouched. The hull sat clean and sharp, as if it had settled gently instead of being ripped apart by combat or a storm. That alone created a silence on the deck. Ships don't end up like that by accident. But the biggest shock came when the team reviewed the ocean floor around it. The seabed didn't look natural. No scattered debris, no rocky buildup, just this smooth, wide patch of sand surrounding the wreck. Almost like someone had swept it clear. The divers didn't understand it yet, but they could feel it. Something happened here. Something that wasn't explained by storms, torpedoes, or anything in the official records. When the crew finally geared up and prepared for the first descent, nobody spoke much. The oxygen hissing through their regulators sounded louder than usual. Even the water felt heavier as they sank toward the dark outline waiting below. It was the kind of silence that makes your stomach tighten, because every instinct tells you you're about to see something you aren't supposed to see. And the truth is, they were. The wreck shouldn't have been there, and the reason it survived so perfectly was the first sign that whatever happened on that ship had nothing to do with weather at all. Markings of a Nazi escort destroyer. As soon as the divers arrived at the bow of the wreck, something caught their attention and made them freeze mid-water. A metal plaque, dark with age but still readable in pieces, clung stubbornly to the hull. The first letter was clear, a bold Z. The rest of the number was broken off, but that single letter was enough to make the entire dive team tense up. Ships labeled with Z in the German Navy were Zerstorer-class destroyers, and only a handful were ever unaccounted for. Finding one randomly on the seafloor was not luck. It meant something had been moved, hidden, or covered up long before any of them were born. Once the team returned to the surface, the researchers got to work comparing the few clues they had with wartime naval records. They spent hours going through old files, coded messages, and final movement reports from the last chaotic months of 1945. Eventually, one name surfaced. A destroyer was reported lost while escorting evacuation vessels during Germany's collapse. According to official history, it went down under chaotic conditions as the fleet scattered. But matching that story with what the divers found made no sense at all. The recorded sinking location and the wreck's actual position were almost 70 kilometers apart. That is not a small error or a mistake in paperwork. Ships do not drift that far without someone noticing, especially not a heavily armed naval destroyer. The discovery threw the entire historical record into question. The team sat around the table looking at side-by-side maps showing where the ship was supposed to be and where it actually rested. If the ship did not sink where it was reported, then why was it so far off the known route? Why was it traveling deeper into restricted waters during the final days of the war when its orders should have been simple? Get civilians out, avoid combat, survive long enough to regroup. None of that matched what the divers found. As the questions grew, the mood on the salvage vessel shifted. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. A destroyer does not travel that far off course without a reason. Someone must have ordered it or forced it. Someone important enough to keep the change off the books. And whatever the ship was carrying must have been valuable enough to risk breaking formation and heading into waters where no Allied ships were hunting. The divers returned to the wreck the next morning with a different mindset. They were no longer just exploring a sunken ship. They were stepping into a moment of history that had been hidden on purpose. The plaque with the Z was the first clue. The distance from the official coordinates was the second. And deep down, everyone already knew that the next thing they found was going to change everything they thought they understood about the ship's final mission. First dive uncovers secrets. The divers went back down, knowing they had to see what was inside that wreck. They had already confirmed it was not where it was supposed to be, and the mysterious hull markings only raised more questions. So when they reached the upper structure of the ship and spotted a jagged opening near a ventilation shaft, they paused. This was not the kind of damage you expect from a torpedo or a depth charge. The metal was pushed outward instead of bent inward. Whatever caused that rupture came from inside the ship. Once they slipped through the opening, the mood changed immediately. Their lights cut through heavy darkness and revealed a scene that felt frozen in the exact moment the crew had fled. Old headsets still sat on consoles as if officers had dropped them mid-sentence. Metal cups were on the floor near what once was the radio station. Navigation charts were still clipped in place on a wall, untouched by the chaos that likely unfolded seconds before the explosion. Nothing looked organized or intentionally abandoned. It felt more like people ran without looking back. They moved deeper, checking each corridor carefully. The ship was so well preserved that it almost felt like trespassing inside a real military vessel rather than exploring a decades-old wreck. But the strangest part came when they reached a row of compartments secured with mechanical locks. Every one of them was still shut tight. A combat loss usually leaves doors buckled or blown open by pressure changes. Seeing them locked made no sense. It suggested that some crew members tried to secure areas right before disaster struck. As the divers tried to document everything, their cameras started fogging up. At first, they thought it was a malfunction, until they noticed bursts of warm air slipping from cracks in the steel. Pockets of trapped air still lingered in sealed sections of the ship, creating sudden temperature shifts that made their equipment struggle. The presence of warm air after so many years underwater was unsettling. It meant some compartments had remained airtight since the moment the ship went under. The divers exchanged glances through their masks. They kept pushing forward because there was no turning back now. Whatever happened here had been kept off all official records, and every new detail pointed toward a crisis that unfolded inside the ship, not outside it. When they reached a wider chamber near the center of the vessel, they stopped again. The room looked like it had been used for meetings or planning. Papers were still scattered around a long, fallen table. A single chair was lodged sideways against the wall, frozen in place. It looked like someone had knocked it over during a rush to escape or seal something shut. Nobody said a word. The evidence was stacking up fast, and it all pointed to one truth. Whatever happened on this destroyer was not recorded in any wartime log for a reason. Nazi cargo that wasn't supposed to exist. When the divers moved into the forward section of the ship, they entered an area that looked far more organized than the rest of the wreck. The storage hold had collapsed in places, but the overall structure was still recognizable. Their lights swept across what looked like ordinary debris at first, until one of the divers stopped and pointed. Something rectangular and metallic sat wedged against a collapsed beam. Then another, and another. Within seconds, they realized they were looking at several large crates, lined up in a formation that did not match standard naval supply layouts. These were not ordinary cargo boxes. The metal was reinforced with extra ribbing and heavy brackets that seemed oddly designed. The locking mechanisms were larger than what you would see on routine equipment containers. They looked more like something you would find in a high-security facility instead of a warship. The divers circled the crates slowly, trying to see if any markings survived. Most of the paint had been eaten away by years underwater, but a few symbols remained faintly visible, enough to trigger a flood of questions. Back on the surface, the researchers compared the crate designs to archived photographs, and that is when everything changed. The brackets and metalwork were identical to the ones mentioned in old German memos tied to something referred to as Material S under Directive Blackbird. Historians knew about the directive. It showed up in classified paperwork toward the end of the war. But no one ever found the actual cargo. Everyone assumed it was lost during the panicked evacuations as territories fell. Seeing those crates in the hold of the destroyer meant the missing cargo had been loaded onto this ship for a reason that was never documented. What made the discovery even stranger was the construction of the crates themselves. The exterior was lined with a lead-based alloy, something not normally used on naval transports. Lead linings were usually meant to block exposure, protect fragile documents, or shield delicate technology. That single detail forced the team to rethink what these boxes could contain. If it were something routine, the Germans would not have used such heavy protective material. Whatever was inside was important enough to be shielded from water, heat, and maybe even radiation. The divers returned to the hold for a closer look, careful not to disturb anything. The crates were in surprisingly in condition for objects that had been underwater for decades. That level of preservation did not feel accidental. It felt intentional, as if someone wanted the contents to survive no matter what happened to the ship. The more they inspected the area, the clearer it became that this was not simple cargo storage. The layout looked deliberate, positioned in a way that suggested they were secured quickly but with care. The tension among the team kept building as they realized the ship had clearly veered far from its recorded course. Now they were staring at containers tied to a secret directive that historians had spent years trying to trace. Every clue pointed toward a mission that had been hidden from the rest of the world. And the truth was sitting right in front of them, sealed inside those lead-lined crates. Unrecorded last confrontation on board. Moving deeper into the ship, the divers felt the air grow heavier around them. The officers' corridor was tight and cramped, and as their lights swept across the walls, they saw strange markings that clearly did not belong in a normal wreck. Thin grooves ran across the metal surface in uneven lines. When they examined them up close, the divers realized they were looking at bullet scoring. The markings were clustered tightly, all angled in a way that suggested someone had fired at close range, right there in the cramped hallway. They followed the direction of the scoring until they reached a metal hatch halfway down the corridor. At first, it appeared jammed, but when they brushed off some sediment, they saw the edges had melted together. The metal was fused in irregular lumps, and one side showed streaks of heat damage. Someone had welded it shut in a hurry, not in a clean professional way, but in a desperate attempt to lock something on the other side. That discovery changed the mood instantly. A welded hatch inside a sinking destroyer raised more questions than answers. What were they trying to seal off? Why would anyone try to trap something below deck while the ship was still operational? And if the crew was following standard protocols, why was none of this recorded anywhere? The divers kept searching, and the next clue made everything even stranger. Scattered across the floor were small, personal items that looked like they belonged to the crew. A compass, a leather patch, torn cloth, even a few identification tags. But once the team on the surface checked the names against the official roster of the destroyer believed to be missing, something did not line up. Several of the tags belonged to people who were never listed on that ship. This pushed the investigation into an entirely different direction. The only explanation that fit the evidence was the presence of additional personnel who were not part of the documented crew. A shadow crew. Late in the war, German intelligence divisions were known to embed unlisted operatives on select vessels to move sensitive cargo or monitor secret missions. Those operations were rarely recorded and usually denied later. Every new detail somewhat proved there had been a conflict among those on board. The bullet marks pointed to a fight. The welded hatch showed someone had tried to seal something or someone in. The mismatched identification tags hinted at hidden passengers. None of this matched the official story of a routine evacuation vessel lost at sea. The divers resurfaced with the uneasy feeling that the ship had not gone down quietly. Something had happened in those final moments, something fierce enough to leave scars on the walls and secrets sealed behind a fused hatch. Hidden compartment time vault. The decision to open the sealed compartment was not taken lightly. Everyone knew the welded hatch hinted at something serious, and cutting through it felt like crossing a line that had been untouched for decades. Still, the team prepared their tools and moved in. The moment the metal finally gave way, a thick wave of silt burst out of the opening and clouded the water. Visibility dropped instantly, and for a few seconds the divers could only see drifting debris swirling around them like a storm. When the water cleared enough to move inside, they found themselves in a space that looked more like a storage vault than part of a destroyer. The walls were reinforced and the floor was lined with brackets that once held equipment in place. But the most surprising part was arranged neatly in the center of the compartment. A row of metal cylinders stood upright in perfect alignment. They were slim, tightly sealed, and built with airtight insulation that had survived the pressure of the deep sea. The divers carefully lifted one of the cylinders and brought it back to the surface. When the team opened it inside the lab tent, they froze. Inside the container were microfilm reels. They were in perfect condition, preserved as if they had been sealed yesterday. Everyone knew microfilm was used during the war for transporting large amounts of information in small hidden formats. Finding them inside a welded compartment of a missing destroyer was beyond unexpected. The decoding team worked through the first reels slowly, unsure what they were about to uncover. At first, the images on the reels showed simple charts and coded tables, but as the technicians processed more frames, the content shifted. Schematics appeared, detailed layouts of facilities. Some were labeled as testing grounds located in territories that had been occupied at the time. None of these documents had ever surfaced in public archives. Then the find became even more startling. One of the reels carried a small insignia printed near the edge of the film. The marking belonged to the Reich Main Security Office. Documents marked with that insignia were intended for the highest levels of command, often bypassing the regular military entirely. They were never meant to travel on standard ships, which raised a question the team could not ignore. Why were they on this destroyer? The carefully arranged cylinders inside the sealed compartment pointed to a mission focused on secrecy rather than evacuation or ordinary transport. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide these records, and another had tried to secure the room by welding it shut. The divers realized they hadn't just opened a hatch. They had uncovered a time capsule containing the kind of information governments work for decades to keep hidden. The reason: the ship went off course. As researchers sorted through more of the microfilm reels, the story behind the ship's strange disappearance finally began to take shape. One reel contained a set of navigation documents that looked different from the rest. The pages were stamped with a bold notice that labeled them as urgent relocation orders. The instructions directed the destroyer to break from its assigned path and travel toward a remote rendezvous point where it was supposed to meet a submarine flotilla. The fact that this meeting never happened made the discovery even more suspicious. The route itself complicated the story. It was marked as Eyes Only, a classification used only when orders come from the highest levels of authority and bypass the usual approval chain. That meant the officers on this ship had been following secret instructions that were not meant to be logged, shared, or questioned. Whoever issued them wanted the ship detached from normal operations and hidden under the radar. Back inside the wreck, the divers continued their search for anything that could explain why the mission was cut short. Near one of the central communication stations, they found a damaged Morse transmitter lying at an awkward angle. The metal frame was bent out of shape, and the wiring inside had been forcibly yanked apart. It was clear that someone had tried to disable it, not because of enemy fire, but because they did not want any messages leaving the ship. When the equipment was analyzed, the technicians noticed scratch marks around the mounting points. The marks indicated the transmitter had been removed fast. Someone had attempted to destroy the outgoing communication line just before the ship lost control. That could only mean one thing. A message was either being blocked or stopped from reaching its intended recipient. The team reached out to naval historians to cross-check the ship's location and timeline with any known Allied activity in the area. The answer came back quickly. No Allied fleet, aircraft, or patrol had been recorded in that region on the night the ship disappeared. There were no enemy forces to chase it off course and no external threats to push it into deeper waters. Every sign pointed inward. The destroyer had not been running from an attack. It had been running from something happening on board. The evidence lined up in a way that made the researchers uneasy. Secret orders rerouted the ship toward a classified rendezvous point. The meeting never took place. Someone sabotaged the Morse transmitter to stop communication, and there were signs of conflict inside the vessel. Whatever doomed the ship came from within its own walls. As the divers surfaced at dusk, the weight of their discovery hung over the team. What they were uncovering pointed to more than a simple wartime accident. They were piecing together a hidden mission that had descended into panic, secrecy, and chaos. And the reasons behind it were still lying deeper in the wreck, waiting for them to uncover next. The truth behind the internal explosion. This was the moment everyone on the research team had been waiting for. Up until now, the story felt like scattered puzzle pieces. But once the forensic results came in, everything clicked in a way that made even the most experienced investigators go quiet. You could tell the divers sensed it too. This wreck was no accident, no unlucky wartime casualty drifting to the sea floor. What happened inside that ship was something far more deliberate. The first breakthrough came from a set of scorched metal fragments lifted from deep inside the ruptured ventilation corridor. Lab technicians ran their tests twice, then a third time just to be sure. The chemical signatures showed compounds used in a specific type of shaped charge designed by German sabotage units. Not a bomb dropped from above, not a torpedo, not friendly fire. This was an inside job, the kind meant to destroy evidence before anyone else could touch it. That single finding set off an avalanche of new questions. Who planted it? When? And more importantly, why detonate something that powerful inside your own ship? As the forensic team kept analyzing the debris, a darker picture started forming. The divers had also recovered bulkhead panels peppered with irregular bullet paths. These were not neat, controlled shots from a trained firing line. They were abrupt, chaotic, fired in tight spaces by men who were either panicking or turning on one another. You could almost imagine the scene in those last few minutes. Shouts echoing through steel corridors, boots slamming on metal floors, and terrified sailors realizing something was happening that they were never briefed on. Many researchers believed the crew had divided into two factions. One group followed secret scuttling orders issued to protect whatever intelligence was locked away in the sealed compartment. The other group wanted out. Some probably did not even know what the ship was carrying. They just knew something was wrong, and they tried to stop the officers from sinking them along with whatever sensitive cargo they had been entrusted with. The placement of the shaped charge made everything even more suspicious. It was positioned precisely where it would cripple the ship instantly, but still give the officers time to reach that sealed compartment. They were clearly prioritizing those microfilms over the lives of the men on board. Historians later pointed out that only high-ranking intelligence personnel would have been authorized to order such extreme measures. And then there was the detail that made everyone sit up. The sealed compartment itself had been reinforced from the inside. Someone took the time to prepare that space as a last stand. They were desperately trying to safeguard the intelligence files right up to the moment the entire operation spiraled out of control. At this point, the divers realized they were not just exploring a wreck. They were digging through the final moments of a crew trapped between duty, secrecy, and fear, all converging in a single catastrophic choice that sent the ship to the bottom. Secrets retrieved from wreck. By the time the salvage crew finished the last lift operation, everyone on deck could feel that this wasn't just another routine recovery. The tension had changed into something that made people speak in low tones and double-check the crates strapped to the hoist. When the containers finally thudded onto the deck, it was like the whole ship exhaled. These weren't random wartime leftovers. They were pieces of a secret the ocean had held onto for decades. Inside the reinforced crates were the real treasures. Not gold, not weapons, but something far more dangerous. What the divers had recovered was documented proof that high-ranking Nazi command had been moving classified intelligence archives in the final stretch of the war. These weren't just loose papers. They were organized microfilmed records, encrypted schematics, and tightly sealed dossiers meant for extraction units preparing to vanish into post-war underground networks. It was the kind of material people whispered about but had never actually seen. Once analysts got a look at the microfilms, the entire atmosphere shifted again. Historians had spent years arguing about the last chaotic months of the Third Reich, especially the rumors about evacuation efforts that supposedly involved secret relocation of assets, science teams, and intelligence officers. Now, those debates were over. The films contained first-hand evidence showing that late-war officials were scrambling to preserve their most sensitive operations long before the surrender was announced. The shock didn't come from a single document, but from the sheer volume of information. Reports on covert communication hubs, lists of field agents assigned to sabotage missions, technical outlines for research programs that were quietly erased from official records, packages of diplomatic back-channel messages that hinted at negotiations no one had ever publicly acknowledged. It was the blueprint of a hidden system that had been buried under water and silence. For decades, researchers had wondered what happened to several wartime archives that vanished without a trace as the regime collapsed. Now the answer was sitting in climate-controlled storage, rescued from the belly of a ship that never completed its mission. Today, those intact crates are guarded as one of the most significant intelligence recoveries ever pulled from a sunken World War II German vessel. The divers thought they were retrieving artifacts. Instead, they brought back a missing chapter of history, sealed away under the cold weight of the sea until someone finally dared to look. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.